Hát jó napot kívánok, nagyon szépen köszönöm, hogy itt lehetek, és köszönöm dr. Kundettinek ezt a meghívást. Nagyon jól érzem magam, 4 hónapot leszek itt most Magyarországon, alkotói szabadságon, 1 hónapja érkeztem, és nagyon örülök, hogy itt lehetek, és hogy ezt az előadást megtarthatom. Remélem mindenki hall engem hátul. Igen? Jó. És röviden elmondanám, hogy miért is lesz angolul az előadás. Ugye én magyar származású vagyok, Magyarországon születtem, de összesen 8 évet éltem Magyarországon, 30 éve vagyok kint az USA-ban, majdnem, és körülbelül 10 éve vagyok, ősszel lesz 10 éve az Oregon State Egyetemen. Úgyhogy az összes tanulmány nekem angolul van a fejemben, a statisztikai kifejezések is angolul vannak a fejemben, úgyhogy gondoltam, hogy egyszerűbb nekem angolul előadni, de nyugodtan lehet kérdezni a végén magyarul is, és akkor megpróbálok én is magyarul válaszolni. Úgyhogy kezdeném is akkor az előadást. Ugye a cím Cannabis Use Among Young Adults in the United States, Emerging Patterns and Implications for Mental Health and Addiction Risk. Okay. I thought I would start out telling you a little bit about the legal status of cannabis in the United States. This is going to be quite different from maybe what you are used to seeing in Europe. So in the United States, we see that cannabis is legal in 40 states for medical use, and in 24 states it is legal for recreational use. We have some actually very recent news from April 23rd, so only 4 days ago. It was announced by the Trump administration that they are planning to immediately move medical marijuana from what's called a Schedule I substance in the United States to a Schedule III substance. Now, you probably don't know what this means, but in the US, a Schedule I substance is considered something that has no medical use and a high potential for abuse. So Schedule III substances are ones that have some accepted medical use and a low risk of abuse. So just to compare, right now, Schedule I substances would be things like heroin, LSD, MDMA. They require a lot of regulatory oversight to even be able to do any research with those substances, whereas a Schedule III substance would include something like steroids, acetaminophen, codeine combinations, and ketamine. So this is actually a very big change coming to the United States right now, to be able to start doing research, specifically with medical marijuana. And again, just heard of this news 4 days ago. What does this mean for research? It will probably mean a lot less hurdles to be able to do research with cannabis. Currently, there's a lot of oversight that's needed by a lot of governmental agencies, and so that's going to be changing quite a bit. That can be very beneficial for actually being able to research the type of cannabis products that people are using in the United States. Because up until now, the cannabis that was being studied in the United States was coming mainly from one provider who was growing cannabis at the University of Mississippi. Now it's going to be possible to study cannabis that's being sold at actual cannabis dispensaries that are very widely available in the US. Okay, so this is the situation in the United States. What does it look like in Europe? Here's a map of the legality of cannabis in Europe. So in the green colors, you're going to see where cannabis is legal for recreational use. Right now, that's in Malta, Luxembourg, Germany, the Czech Republic, and then on the eastern side in Georgia. Where is cannabis decriminalized? Meaning, where is there no criminal penalty for using cannabis or tolerance for using? This would include Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. And then in green, we're going to see states, or countries, I should say, where we see medical use being legalized in Europe. And then finally, all of the gray countries are the ones where cannabis is currently illegal, including Hungary. What does illegal mean? Well, if you use cannabis in Hungary, you might face some type of penalty for using cannabis. That it could include jail time. Although, to my understanding, using small amounts might result in some type of treatment program initiation rather than extensive jail time. But another important distinction that I want to point out is that in Europe, there are no commercial retail sales for cannabis, which is very different from the United States. You can, of course, obtain cannabis in some cannabis social clubs, for example, in the Netherlands, or select coffee shops, but the formal type of cannabis retail sales that we have in the United States is absent in Europe. Okay, so now you might be wondering, why did cannabis become legalized in the United States? What was the purpose of this? So let me tell you a little bit more about the intention of legalizing cannabis in the US. Well, one of the first purposes was to reduce illicit markets and risk to consumers. All right, this is very important because when cannabis is being sold on the streets illicitly, it can contain a number of other types of additives, a number of other types of substances that consumers are unaware of. Right? So by regulating cannabis and selling it at dispensaries, this can actually make cannabis use much safer for individuals. So this is really important. The second point I want to highlight is that there are a number of economic benefits for legalizing cannabis. So legalizing cannabis comes with taxation, right? And so what that means is across the United States, there's a range of cannabis taxes, anything from as low as 6% to as high as 37% taxation on the sale of cannabis. This depends again on the state. Now, where do those taxes go? Well, they're going to go to providing mental health services, education, and public safety. And a lot of jobs are also created in the cannabis market. So cultivation jobs, production jobs, retail sales of cannabis, as well as lab technicians. So these are just a few examples. Okay, so these are economic benefits. Now, the third point I want to highlight is that there's also benefits in the US, particularly for social equity and criminal justice. So historically, minoritized individuals, largely Black and African American individuals in the United States, have been disproportionately affected by cannabis use and been incarcerated and jailed for using cannabis. And so by legalizing cannabis, the hope is that this inequity will also decrease. And then the last really important point is making cannabis restricted to individuals who are 21 and older. Similar to alcohol use in many states in the United States, you have to be 21 to be able to purchase alcohol, and also in dispensaries that sell cannabis, you have to be 21 years old. And so this minimizes then risk to young consumers. Okay, so a lot of these points seem, relatively positive, right? These are good things. But what could be a potential risk for legalizing cannabis? Because like everything, we see risks as well, not just benefits. So currently, I'm in the process of writing what's called an umbrella review paper. And this is a review paper of many review papers and meta-analyses investigating what are some of the unexpected effects of cannabis legalization within the states. So in collaboration with some researchers in the US and also in Australia, we've been working on trying to investigate what were the actual effects. Now that cannabis has been legalized in many states actually for 10 years, in Oregon where I live, cannabis became legal for recreational use in 2015. So we're at more than 10 years now. So we have enough data to be able to start understanding what are some of the effects of legalization. Well, what we've noticed is that there's been significant increase in use among young adults. There's been a significant increase in the prevalence of cannabis use disorder diagnoses among young adults. We also, of course, have many products available in the United States that have increased in potency, so THC being the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. We have products that I'll show you later today have very high THC potency, including concentrate products and edibles. We also have seen a significant increase in emergency department services being used and accidental ingestion by children and poisonings. This is particularly true when we look at cannabis edibles, because oftentimes these edibles look like candy or gummies and are accidentally ingested by children in the home. And then finally, there's been a significant increase in individuals driving under the influence of cannabis, which has been related to increased traffic accidents. Okay, so we see some benefits on the previous slide, but also some risks to legalization. And so I think this is just important context to keep in mind as I move forward today and tell you a little bit more about what are the rates that we see for adolescents and young adults in particular, and what are some of the more recent findings in the United States with regards to the effects of cannabis on brain development and neurocognition. Okay, so let's transition here and talk a little bit about the prevalence of past 12-month cannabis use. So I hope everyone can see this slide. I know the font is probably very small in the back, but I'll kind of walk you through what we're looking at here. So this is data that comes from a large study called Monitoring the Future, and it's a study that has been going on since the 1980s approximately, so very long-term study, trying to evaluate cannabis use in adolescents in 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade, and then actually tracking these individuals over time. So currently, this study has about 120,000 people who've participated, each year enrolling about 20,000 new individuals. So what we're looking at in this figure is on the x-axis, we are going to see cannabis use starting out in the 80s, and then all the way to some of the more recent years, 2024. And the different colors represent different age groups, okay? So in blue, we have what we would define as young adults, 19 to 30-year-olds. In green, we have 35 to 50-year-olds. And then a few data points have now emerged for the older population of middle-aged 55 to 65-year-olds. So here's the trend, right? For young adults, we see that there was a relatively stable trend for most of the 90s and maybe early 2000s. But what we're seeing now is some increases, particularly in the more recent years. So if we look at this increase here in the last 5 years, as well as the last 10 years, these are significant increases in young adult past year cannabis use. And similarly, for individuals who are in this 35 to 50-year-old age range, we have significant increases in cannabis use. So these are some changes that are happening right now in real time, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. And so what could this mean? Well, this also aligns with the time that cannabis was legalized across many US states. Okay, so what do the rates look like? You probably can't see it in the back, so I should tell you that in the past year, about 40% of young adults say they've used cannabis. Okay, so that might be surprising to many of you because I will show you some data that suggests that that rate is much higher in the US than it is in Europe. So about 40% have used cannabis in the last year. Okay, how about daily cannabis use? These are people who say that in the last month, they've used cannabis pretty much every day. At least 20 days of the last 30 days, they've used cannabis. Similarly to past year, we see significant increases in past or daily cannabis use for the 19 to 30-year-olds as well as the 35 to 50-year-olds. Okay, so this is concerning because these are individuals who are saying that they use cannabis pretty much every day, and about 10% of young adults report that. So that has also increased. And another thing that has changed recently, which I think is really fascinating, is that if we look at sex differences in cannabis use between males and females, historically, maybe it's not surprising, generally we see males report more cannabis use than females. Okay, so males are going to be in the blue, females are going to be in the green. What's happening now? These lines are starting to cross over. Okay, so this suggests that we actually, in more recent years, are seeing more females report cannabis use than males in the United States. So this gender gap or this sex gap has been closing for the last several years. Okay? So what's happening here? Why are we seeing all these changes? Well, I think one important time to start looking at these changes is the adolescent young adult period. And so I want to show you some other data from Monitoring the Future that looks at asking individuals, how much do you think cannabis is available? And do you think it's risky to use cannabis? Okay, so those are some questions that Monitoring the Future also asks during their survey. And so if we look at this timeline again, from the late 1970s all the way to the present day, we see that there's going to be some changes that adolescents report in terms of what they consider to be risky. Okay, so here, in the 90s, many adolescents reported that they thought cannabis use was risky. Now, why is that? There's some political changes happening in the United States at this time. You might have heard of the phrase, the war on drugs. Okay, the administrations at that time were really pushing that message. Okay, so many adolescents thought that cannabis use was risky. Well, if you think that cannabis use is risky, you also report using cannabis less. Okay, but the risk has declined significantly, as we see. Most people now are not really saying that cannabis use is that risky. Only about 30% or so today are reporting that cannabis use is considered to be risky. So there's a change that's happened in the United States in terms of the perception of cannabis use, right? In terms of how previously it might have been what we call stigmatized, that it's not good to use cannabis. And more recently, we see that people actually don't think it's that bad, okay? And this perception probably in part contributes to some of the changes that we've been seeing in terms of the reported use patterns of cannabis use. So I want to introduce a little bit more with regards to some survey data, because I think this is also very interesting. It comes from a different survey called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And in this survey, they indicate that past year cannabis use for 12 to 17-year-olds is about 10%. And again, we're over 30% for the 18 to 25-year-old demographic. Now, of course, if we look at past month cannabis use, it's going to be a little bit lower, so 6% for 12 to 17-year-olds, and a little bit lower at 24% for 18 to 25-year-olds. But what's concerning is the number of individuals who are meeting criteria for a diagnosis of cannabis use disorder. So this is receiving a clinical diagnosis of CUD or cannabis use disorder, with about 16% of 18 to 25-year-olds meeting that criteria. Okay, so this is quite high, and there's a risk for that to increase, according to, again, some of that literature review that we're conducting right now, suggesting that legalization might actually be increasing the rate of cannabis use disorder in the US. Okay, so I live in Oregon, and I've been living there for almost 10 years. And if you're not familiar with all of the states, that's okay. Oregon is right here. So we are north of California, and we are south of Washington state on the Pacific coast, okay? And Corvallis is a smaller university town where Oregon State University is located. And generally what we see in Oregon is that rates of cannabis use are higher than the national average, okay? So people in Oregon use cannabis even more than the average US adult for past year, past month, and the annual rate of first cannabis use. And so for me, conducting research in Oregon is actually very important for recruiting participants within our state, because we do see a higher prevalence of cannabis use. And just to compare, I did want to mention this because I looked at some of the European data recently from the European Drug Report that was published this past year. And in Hungary, only about 11% of 18 to 35-year-olds report past year use of cannabis. And if you look at past month use of cannabis in Hungary for the young adult group, only about 3% of young adults report past month cannabis. So as you can see, those rates are, again, much different from what we have in Oregon, with some of these darker colors here representing over 20% in terms of the prevalence of use within the past month. Okay, so I want to transition a little bit to telling you about products, because products in the United States look very different from what you might be used to. So maybe for cannabis, you imagine individuals who are smoking cannabis, and that's typically how people use cannabis. They smoke it in a joint, they smoke it through a bong, they smoke it through some type of pipe or device, right? So that is the primary form, and it's the primary route of administration. But in the US, because we have a legal cannabis market in many states, there are other products that are available now. And so on the left-hand side, you're going to see flower, right? The typical product you're used to seeing. This typically now has a potency of about 25% THC, which I should mention is also much higher than the potency from the 1990s, which was about 5% THC. So products are much more potent these days than they were several decades ago. We also have what's called concentrates. Now, concentrates are THC products that are very high potency products. They can contain anywhere, 60%, almost up to 100% THC potency. And these are usually used through vaping or what's called dabbing. Now, dabbing is a term that is used to describe how THC is extracted using a solvent like butane. And it's consumed via this device called a dab rig. And it's named based on its appearance, its consistency. So some of the names you'll hear are wax or shatter based on its appearance. And then finally, we have edibles. Edibles are oftentimes consumed in candies or sometimes even teas or liquids. These are products that have servings of about 5 to 10 milligrams of THC, and they're consumed orally, okay? So these are the three main forms of administration. And I just want to point this out because this is, again, very different from what is available in terms of the products here in Europe relative to the United States. And what's concerning for many researchers are understanding how the use of these very high potency products affects brain development, particularly during adolescence, how it affects young adults and mental health, because we know that these products are associated with higher risks of negative mental health outcomes, even from some of the newer research that's come out. Okay, so I hope it's okay if I talk a little bit about the neuroscience of cannabis use. I don't want to get too much into the details, but I think it's important to understand how cannabis affects the brain. So I'll tell you a little bit here that cannabis acts on the natural system within the brain called the endocannabinoid system. And THC is the main psychoactive component of cannabis. And there are cannabinoid receptors located in different parts of the brain, namely in this reward area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. And when THC activates these cannabinoid receptors, it actually results in an increase in a reward neurotransmitter we call dopamine to be released into the reward center, the nucleus accumbens. And so this increase in dopamine release, just like we see with many substances, likely drives individuals to use cannabis. And we also see that in areas of the frontal lobe, right here, we have increases in dopamine release as well that can affect healthy adaptive decision-making for individuals, particularly, again, during a really important time of brain development, which is adolescence and young adulthood. So that's a little bit about what's happening to reward circuitry. And now I'd like to tell you about some of the most recent data that's been published on how using cannabis in one's lifetime, particularly during adolescence, may affect brain structure. So this data comes from the Imogen study, which is actually a European study involving 8 different sites within Europe. They have collected data for many years now, and this is data that includes about 800 participants. And in this study, they wanted to see if individuals started using cannabis during adolescence and they were followed up 5 years later, what was happening to their brain during that time. And so after the 5-year follow-up period, they conducted another analysis using MRI technology or magnetic resonance imaging, and they found that individuals who are using cannabis more, had more lifetime occasions of use, had reductions in these blue areas in the frontal lobe for the thickness of the cortex in the brain. Okay, so individuals, again, who used more had reductions in prefrontal cortex thickness. And so we see, again, through some of these structural studies that there are alterations that can happen to the brain with greater lifetime use of cannabis. And this is another figure that comes from that paper, and here you can see a little bit more that as cannabis use increases, so here's 0 use, and here's more than 40 uses, we see that there's reductions in the thickness of this part of the frontal lobe, both for this figure here, showing the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and then down here showing the left side of that same area. So not only does brain structure seem to change, but also we see that lifetime cannabis use is also affecting function in the brain. In particular, in this study, they looked at how heavy use of cannabis might be impacting functions like working memory. And this comes from the Human Connectome Project, which looked at young adults ages 22 to 36, and found that individuals who are in the orange bars, people who are using cannabis heavily, they had lower activation in working memory-related brain areas compared to the non-users, but also compared to the moderate users as well. And so there seems to be this dose-dependent effect that we're seeing for cannabis on brain activity as well, particularly when you're doing cognitive tasks that involve working memory in this case. Okay, so there are some effects we're seeing for structure and function in the brain. Unfortunately, we don't have any FDA-approved medications in the United States for cannabis use disorder, and I don't think there's anything approved in Europe either. What we can do is intervene and try to see if brief interventions might reduce cannabis use, particularly for adolescents and young adults. This review paper indicated that there are some effects potentially for brief interventions. This was a study that looked at recruitment occurring from different sources, but half of the participants were recruited from schools. They had 1 to 3 month follow-up periods. They used personalized feedback on frequency of use, consequences of use, what are the pros and cons of use, what are individuals' values and life goals. And in this meta-analysis, they did suggest that brief interventions could be beneficial for reducing the incidence of cannabis use disorder and increasing abstinence. So that's promising, but I did find a more recent meta-analysis that found no effects of brief interventions for reducing cannabis use, although if these brief interventions are delivered in an emergency department setting, it's possible they may be related to some small but significant reductions of long-term use. Likely, once you've arrived to the emergency department, you've recognized that there might be something serious happening, and so that might be a setting where it's more beneficial to deliver these brief interventions. But these are often limited by studies that are small in their sample size, they're underpowered. Most people are non-treatment seeking individuals. And it's difficult to generalize some of these findings to longer follow-up periods, right? What happens after 1 to 3 months? Because these are not participants who are typically followed much later, okay? So we need to do a better job in measuring outcomes that are pretty similar across studies, because these studies will look at outcomes that are quite different. How frequently are people using cannabis? What are their cannabis use disorder symptoms? What are their consequences? Did they remain abstinent or not? And also, when we include participants in these studies, oftentimes we use different criteria. We might say, we're recruiting people who have at least monthly use, or maybe more than weekly use. And so these differences could also explain some of the variation in the findings across these interventions. So So that's my introduction. I know I'm short on time, but I do want to tell you about some of the work in my research lab. And here's a picture of my undergraduate researchers on the right and my graduate student, Alexia Obrakta, on the left. Something that we're really interested in my research group are the types of intrapersonal correlates of problematic use. So I've told you a little bit about the policy level effects, right? How does policy maybe change cannabis use? Then there's community effects, right? Who do you associate with? Who are your peers? Who are you hanging out with? That can also affect your cannabis use. But personally, some of your own characteristics and your own motivations can affect cannabis use as well. And we call that your cannabis use motives. Right? Why do you use cannabis? What are the reasons? Are you using cannabis to cope with stress? Are you using cannabis because there's some social pressure from your friends? Maybe because you just like the feeling. You like to have fun. So that would be enhancement reasons. And the reason that we care about these motives is a lot of these motives have actually been related to problematic patterns of cannabis use. So previous research suggests that all of these motives, in particular coping motives, are really strongly associated with problematic use. And so what I'm interested in understanding better is, how does sex play a role in this relationship? Do we see the same relationship for males and females, or are there some differences? So for our study, we looked at a larger sample of participants who were recruited in an online survey. They had an opportunity to win a gift card. A larger amount and a smaller amount was given to them. They had to be fluent in English and US citizens and age of majority, which in most states is 18 or older. So we had 741 participants who used cannabis in the past 30 days. Most of them were male, still not that surprising, and then a portion of them were female. These were young adults on average, so most of them on average, we see this is about a 27-year-old age group. 70% of the sample was under 30 years old. There are some differences in age where our male participants were actually older than our female participants. And some slight differences in cannabis use, but actually kind of matching what I told you earlier. The rates of cannabis use are not that different between males and females in our study. On average, people are reporting about 11 days of cannabis use in the past month. So participants completed the marijuana motives measure, which is a 25-item questionnaire. It asks individuals how frequently their own marijuana use is motivated by each of these reasons. On a scale of 1, never, to 5, almost always. So enhancement would be, I use cannabis because I like the feeling, or expansion is to expand my awareness, coping, to forget my worries, conformity, to be liked, or social because it makes social gatherings more fun. So what do the sex differences look like? All of our motivations were actually higher for males relative to females, except for enhancement. We did not find any significant differences for enhancement. For the other motives, we do see higher motives for males relative to females. So what we wanted to see is, do these motives relate to problematic use? So participants also completed the marijuana problem scale, which is a 19-item self-report scale. And in this scale, they would say, has marijuana caused them problems in the past month? And these problems could be problems with social relationships, problems with self-esteem, problems with work and productivity, or financial problems, or even problems related to physical and mental health. So you could have no problem, a minor problem, or a serious problem, okay? And so these are some examples on the bottom that you can see were included in this questionnaire. So what we analyzed in this study was the relationship between these cannabis use motives and problematic use. And the moderator here was sex. We wanted to understand how sex moderated this association. We also controlled for really important covariates that are often related to problematic use. So these were age, race, ethnicity, income, education level, and the past 30-day use of cannabis. So what did our results show? There were 3 significant moderations. So for enhancement, expansion, and coping, we saw significant interactions where individuals who were male had a stronger relationship between those motives and problematic use relative to females. Okay, so these are the interactions which show that if you're male, this effect is going to be enhanced for you relative to females. So what does this mean? Well, male individuals might be particularly prone to these problematic patterns of use when they endorse these types of motives for using cannabis. And one of the most important ones was enhancement. We saw the largest effect size for enhancement, which is the motive to use cannabis because you like the feeling, because it's fun, because it provides you pleasure. So that suggests that using cannabis for enhancement motives, if you're male, might be particularly important for intervention studies that focus on reducing that type of motivation for using cannabis, reducing the motivation to use for the rewarding effects of the substance. And so how can these inform intervention studies? Well, we know that motives might be particularly important to reduce when it comes to beneficial treatment outcomes. There are some studies, not many, but some studies that do suggest decreasing certain motives, like coping motives for cannabis, can be really beneficial for treatment outcomes in cognitive behavioral therapy. And other studies that suggest that most motives decrease across time in non-treatment seeking adolescent cannabis users who undergo motivational enhancement therapy. Okay, I know that I'm out of time here, so I'll just end with some future directions. I would like to just say that what's really important for this research too is that we try to understand how these different patterns of cannabis use are related to problematic use. So I've told you a little bit today about THC dose becoming much higher in the United States as a function of legalization with the newly available products that we have. So I'd like to do some more research on understanding how THC dose and cannabis use quantity are related to problematic use. You know, the number of grams that individuals are reporting for using cannabis on a daily basis may also be a really important marker as well. And additionally, we now have a lot of data on route of administration, right? So are you using cannabis through inhalation methods, or are you using edibles? What are the products that you're using, so we can try to better understand if certain products are related to more negative consequences. And then another area of research for me would be understanding substance co-use. We know that most people who use cannabis don't use cannabis alone. They often use many other substances. Here are just 2 examples that I'm interested in. Alcohol co-use, and then co-use of psilocybin, which comes from mushrooms that contain this component, which is naturally occurring in several species of mushrooms. And maybe you've heard there's a lot of interest in the potential therapeutic value of psilocybin for treating depression or anxiety disorders, but also we don't know a lot about its recreational and naturalistic use. We know more about what's happening in those clinical trials. So with that, we've surveyed about 1,600 individuals recently. And my graduate student, Alexia Brakta, just finished her master's thesis understanding how cannabis and psilocybin co-use might be related to stress as well as well-being. And then we're collaborating with some folks in the state of Colorado. These are individuals at Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety who've collected a large data set looking at many different substances, including hallucinogens like psilocybin. And so we're also looking at how the co-use of these different substances might affect negative health outcomes and problematic use. And then finally, it would be a dream study for me to be able to look across time longitudinally, starting in the college years, so starting at around age 18 or 19, when youth enter college, and then follow them annually during their university years, so that we can get data on the changes in cannabis use that we're seeing across time, and also what are some of the patterns that emerge as they start experimenting with cannabis use, particularly, again, young adulthood being the time where these rates are the highest. So with that, I would like to just thank a number of individuals, the School of Psychological Science, my department at Oregon State University, the Medical Research Foundation of Oregon, which is an organization that has provided some funding for my research. And then I have several graduate students who are currently already doing other things. Dr. Jess Cavalli is now a postdoc at University of Washington. Dr. Kalina Fahey is at University of New Mexico. And Dr. Chris Mullen is starting a faculty position in North Carolina. And then other graduate students I've had in my lab, including my current student, Alexia. And then a lot of the data that I showed you today in that motive study comes from undergraduate students who helped collect that data. So I want to thank them for all of their efforts as well. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. Köszönöm a figyelmet.